questions. Hopefully they'll respond if they can't hear us. Okay, welcome. Today it is my honor to introduce this panel of lived experience experts exploring the impact of having a spiritual emergency pathologize. This is a very passionate topic for me because I've been through the same thing, and I'm so happy that I get to be here and listen to these incredible four people that are experts by experience. And we're going to start with who's starting. They're going to introduce themselves. Janet,
So I'll do an overview and then we'll introduce.
You want my
You have to go up there.
Yes, okay. So, thank you, Denise, and it's fabulous to have Denise here. Because Denise is part of this whole team and process that we'll be talking about today as well. So Dr. Colleen Chatlos is here as our first presenter. He is from a professor of psychiatry at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And we'll lead it off with his framework for how he sees including spirituality into psychiatric care and mental health, but also with his lived experience. Then Colleen DeJoseph is a psychotherapist, comes to us from Long Island, also part of the team. She will share an introduction and overview of what her PhD dissertation is, her lived experience, and go through the research that she's acquired. And then Sean Blackwell has flown in from Brazil just for this conference. And he said he decided to stay here for a while. But Sean is here from his own practice of bipolar awakenings. You'll see his books online, and will also speak from his spiritual or his lived experience, and also the practice and service he does. I am from my own consulting business called You Have My Word, which is a practice for the last 30 years out in business, but I'm also lived experience, and I'll save my story to the end when I show you a short clip of the video. Okay. So let's start with Dr. Chatlos. And that's very close.
Hello, is that close enough? That's where it's supposed to go out as well. Yeah. Welcome, thank you, Janet, for the brief introduction, and let me say a little bit about myself, and then we'll look at what we're trying to accomplish today. I'm an addiction and child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I've been using spiritual principles in my practice for many years, and I'll be presenting an approach to spirituality and trying to understand what it is that we're all going through. And so the formal objectives are going to be to identify 3 examples of what might help and what doesn't help in supporting the individual through a spiritual emergency experience. To articulate 3 examples of distinguishing between legitimate spiritual and or religious experiences and what is labeled as psychosis is understood by the Western medical model of psychiatry, and verbalize 1 reason why there needs to be greater clinical utilization of DSM-V code of religious or spiritual problem, and I'll say a little bit more about that. And this is the first time I've been at this conference, and just recently have been aware of this group. And I had experiences in meeting people that are really challenging my view of psychosis and psychiatry. And one of my goals is to look at what we need to do to transform psychiatry so that a lot of what the stories are that we have here hopefully won't be happening. So, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in a small town. My father was a minister, and it just happened to be the town where Catholicism's first American-born saint, Elizabeth Ann Seton, set up her Sisters of Charity, so that the town was steeped in religion, Of course, I rebelled against it as a preacher's kid, went away to college, got connected with a little-known religion, went to medical school, and ended up in New York City. And during my residency, which was at Bellevue Psychiatric, I had my first experience that was non-ordinary. And let me describe it a little bit. I'm in my residency, I'm in a psychoanalysis at the time. I wake up one night in a panic. I wake up sweating. I just had this horrible dream of this horde of women crazily chasing me, half naked, and I was in a panic. So I calm myself down, I go back to bed, and I wake up paranoid. I was afraid that I was going to be killed by something or something that day. I did what I could to see my patients. I probably only said hello and goodbye to my patients because I figured they might be able to see what I'm going through. Just to get through the day, to get up to my psychoanalyst. And I always tell the story, I'm going in New York City with my back against the wall, literally afraid of what was going to be attacking me. I go into my analyst's office, I'm afraid he has a camera. I'm afraid he's going to hospitalize me, and God forbid that I be hospitalized at Bellevue. And by the end of the session, he helped me understand that I had literally run into the results of opening to the classical Oedipal conflict that was triggered by a new love relationship. And of course, my father, sex was sin, and I was going to be attacked by my father or whatever for having this sexual relationship. Well, I was psychotic and paranoid for about 3 days in a roller coaster. And during that 3 days, I realized that my emotional brother was Jesus Christ, who sat next to me every morning when we had devotions at home. And throughout the week, whenever I was at services, and pretty much whenever I talked to my father, and that I had just gone to hell for 3 days and had come back from the dead. That showed me that there is something else out there, something non-ordinary, and that's what started my journey. I avoided a hospitalization. So, let's talk about psychiatry. Psychiatry, unfortunately, sometimes is about disease, illness, syndrome, and suffering. The 1994 edition brought in the B code of additional conditions or problems that may be a focus of clinical attention, religious or spiritual problem. The only other places that spirituality or religion were mentioned was in what's called a clinical formulation, where if you have the time, you will go into detail, but it took years to get religion and spirituality specifically there to be looked at. The other section is there are cultural concepts of distress from other cultural traditions. The attack of nerves, semen loss, social withdrawal, wind attacks, devil illness, weakness of nervous system, fright, and there was no mention of spiritually transformative experiences. And that's one of the things that we are trying to do something differently about. What it will look like, we don't know. These are some of the disorders that may be associated with spiritual experience. You can just look at them. It's a host of disorders that have had both psychosis and spiritual experiences affiliated with them. And one of the problems I think, is the foundation for medicine and psychiatry is the biopsychosocial model. The idea that we have a biological, psychological, sociocultural part, and when they are balanced in some magical way, we have health. This came out in 1977, and 3 years later was followed by the DSM-3, which totally medicalized the psychiatry and mental health profession. And where is spirituality? And how might we fit that in? We'll talk about it as the talk goes on. Now, somewhere along the way, this quote guided me. William James, there's an unseen order where one has to characterize the life of religion in the broadest and most general terms possible. One might say that it consists of the belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. This belief and this adjustment are the religious attitude in the soul. This is what makes it ineffable. Like this, there was an unseen order in the objective world throughout history until Sir Isaac Newton identified it with the laws of motion and gravitation. When we turn our interest and awareness internal to our subjective experience, there is also an unseen order. And I'm going to describe it as quickly as possible. Beginning, I've had a lot of conversations recently this week with people from Eastern religious traditions, and I've come to the conclusion American and Western psychiatry is not going to pay attention to a lot of the truths in Eastern traditions until we have our own language. So this is a model that's based on CBT, cognitive behavior theory, beginning with the idea that we have senses, but we then have perceptions of thoughts and feelings and actions. And the next level of understanding is beliefs, values, and habits. And this is where religion lives. And people can have conflicts of those areas, and they can go to mental health and get help because there's a lot of shame in practices that may be against their beliefs or values that are inconsistent with their community. And this is the religious identity. Now, in order to get to spirituality, we have to do something different, and we have to integrate all three of them. It's only the integration of heart, mind, and body that makes all of this work, as you all probably are aware. And that's when we use a language of attitude. Attitude is an integration of a thought, a feeling, and an action. Pessimistic attitude, that'll never work. Emotion, hopelessness, maybe disenchantment, and an action of withdrawal, avoidance, giving up, whatever. And it's when we take this integrated approach to CBT and focus it internally, what we find is our attitudes come from injury to two things that are critical, and one of them was mentioned earlier, and that is self-worth and dignity. And we've operationalized self-worth as self-confidence, self-esteem, and self-confidence. And we've operationalized dignity, sort of different than Pat Deegan mentioned, but dignity, the definition is the quality of esteem or honor. Honor is what dignity is about. And all over the world, dignity is used as a noun. I don't believe it's a noun. It's an expression of what is it that we honor most in each of these areas. In the domain of thinking, what do we honor most about being human? It's making choices with reason. What do we honor most in the area of feelings? It's compassion, beginning with empathy because of mirror neurons and language and our incredible capacity for empathy. And in the domain of action, what we honor most about being human is courage, beginning with honesty, with our knowledge of what might happen if we go out there and we still do it, even at the risk of our life, is what we honor in action. So this begins to be part of the unseen order of how spiritual experience is organized in our life. The next two people are going to share from their personal experience and different frameworks to understand, because I think this panel is, we're trying to figure this out. as everyone of you are. But I think we've got some answers that I've been doing this work for 30 years. We just completed a study where we developed a spiritually focused psychotherapeutic intervention and literally in 8 weeks created spiritual awakenings in men that had long-term addiction and incarceration. So we know we can do something and promote it. So I'm going to turn this over to Colleen, and she will give you a very interesting perspective.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. This is sort of like a full circle moment for me. In 2011, I had an anomalous spiritual experience, and I was involuntarily hospitalized. And I knew what I was experiencing at the time. There was no doubt for me that it was a spiritual experience, but I received a pathological label nonetheless. And I remember when I left the hospital after a week, I just remember thinking that, oh my God, the doctors have no idea what they're talking about, right? So as synchronicity would have it, a short while later, I actually found the work of Blackwell, who will be presenting after me. And he spoke about his personal experience, and he also introduced me to the field of transpersonal psychology. And as a result of learning about the existence of the field, I decided to enter into it, and I now hold a doctorate degree. So when I was thinking about my dissertation, what I recognized was that there was no representation within the research literature of people like me who had a spiritual experience, came in contact with the mental health system, and got diagnosed with a label that they don't agree with. So my study was the first study to look at what the impact is of having a spiritual experience was diagnosed by the Western medical model of psychiatry. So to give a little background information, the terms spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency were coined by Dr. Brock, who's a psychiatrist and his wife. And they're umbrella terms used to sort of express experiences of shamanic initiations, experiences of unitive consciousness, mystical experiences, Kundalini awakening experiences, near-death experiences, psychic opening crises, communication abilities with forms of spirit, past life experiences, possession states, experiences of close encounters with UFOs. More specifically, spiritual emergency is defined as a crisis related to sudden spiritual emergence, during which the process of growth and change becomes chaotic and overwhelming. In such episodes, individuals often suddenly and dramatically enter into new realms of mystical and spiritual experience. However, they may also become fearful, confused, and have difficulty coping with their daily lives, jobs, and relationships. Unfortunately, when somebody experiences something along the lines of what Dr. Brown and his wife described, and they have an unordinary state of consciousness and come into contact with the medical model, they're often misdiagnosed. And it's a shame because in the DSM it specifically states to avoid misdiagnosis, cultural variation in symptoms and explanatory models may lead clinicians to misjudge the severity of a problem or assign the wrong diagnosis. And they specifically state that unfamiliar spiritual explanations may be misunderstood as psychosis. So my study looked at what is the impact of having an anomalous spiritual experience misdiagnosed by the Western medical model. I did an IPA qualitative study, which emphasizes the lived experience of participants, their stories, and their voices. So as I continue, I'm going to read verbatim their quotes. So the 4 things that arose were psychological consequences of misdiagnosis, iatrogenic wounding, wrestling with paradox, and honoring the subjective. So psychological consequences of misdiagnosis. Participants expressed that they grappled with a forcefully imposed false identity. because they said that the label became a lens through which their very identity was filtered by their friends and family. And this resulted in a lot of grief and loss because they lost relationships with friends and family who chose to prioritize the opinion of the medical doctors over their own subjective understanding of what their experience was. They also discussed experiencing the death of their former self. And they also expressed reasserting their insight. So for all of my participants, they all expressed having a firm understanding that their experiences were fundamentally spiritual as they were occurring. And what happened was once they received the diagnostic label, it caused them to sort of compare and contrast their initial insight with what the medical model was saying about their experience, but that only served to reinforce their initial insight. As expressed by one participant when speaking of her hospitalization, she says, I felt this happened when I was 32 years old, and it didn't matter who I had been until that day. From that day on, anything I said was contested. It's like I stopped being who I was, and now I was the mad woman. Another contestant was a married mother to a young child at the time of her diagnosis, and she expressed feeling pressured to comply with a psychiatric intervention out of fear for the consequences to her as a mother. She says, I'm thinking, okay, I have this baby, and I'm married to this man who's not from my culture. He could just pick up and leave with the baby, and I'm gonna be trapped in the loony house, you know? So I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna shut my mouth, and I'm gonna do whatever they tell me to do. She said, I understood my predicament, and discussed how she found solace in recalling the story of when Christ, when Jesus is on the mount, and he's like, he knows he has to die. He says to himself, this is my chalice or my cup and I will drink it. That's what I said to myself, you know, this is my cup and I will drink it. So I surrendered. I surrendered to what was going on. And I said, and I will get out of it. She repeatedly expressed how she felt greatly as a result of the psychiatric intervention. She says, I felt annihilated as a person, you know, I felt infantilized. I felt like I didn't have a say over my own life. I felt stigmatized. I felt broken. Another participant expressed how the psychiatric intervention she received left her like a shadow of her former self, like completely done over, like panic attacks, fat, heavy medicated, and now expressing to the psychiatrist that what she was experiencing with the spiritual experience was akin to digging myself a grave, because you're not given any credit for that. That's just no insight. Iatrogenic wounding. So participants cited the psychiatric labeling, the psychiatric medications, and this treatment by hospital staff as being responsible for an exacerbation and distortion of their subjective experience. They expressed a deep sense of betrayal and disappointment for how they were treated by the system. And they all expressed that what they needed most at the time of their experience was to be in a safe environment with compassionate, validating caregivers. They also expressed that the mistreatment, neglect, and mischaracterization of their experiences as being symptomatic of pathology was predominantly a symptom of mental health professionals and the psychiatric system's own arrested development, and their inability and refusal to recognize their own limitations and biases to the detriment of their patients, which left them within nowhere, turning completely isolated in their experiences. As expressed by one participant who referred to his experience as a non-dual state of consciousness, he said, I get to the hospital and I just said, I have a outlier neurobiological event. It's totally weird, you know? I know that I'm talking fast, but you guys, you know, you're doctors. You're here for me. I was so full of trust. I was like, you're gonna help me because you're gonna listen to what I'm saying, and you're gonna know because you're healthcare professionals that there's crazy and then there's like weird shit, like the dude from the Oliver Sacks books who got hit by lightning, and then he could just play the piano. And I had such full faith, so I just went in there being completely honest, and they were just like, no, it's in your head, and I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm saying, and they were like, this doesn't exist, and I was like, oh shit, and then I realized it's one flew over the cuckoo's nest. There was no like, I couldn't have done any better. I couldn't have put it in more scientific language. Participants also expressed frustration with religious faith leaders. One participant says, when I read about like the descriptions of stream entry, which is a thing of Buddhism, and the descriptions of mania, it's like, oh my God, you're talking about the same thing. And if you integrate this in a good way, you're then it's all like peace and love and stuff, and I've never been happier. But if you let the psychiatrist tell you what you are, it's like a form of, we're just hypnotizing ourselves into feeling like a person anyway. Another one said, I'm just gonna one on top. She says, faith leaders are the biggest hypocrites you've ever met. When you go and tell them that you're having a spiritual experience, they just tell you to go see a doctor. It's like, what? What's going on? And you're talking about heaven and hell. And if I'm going to have an experience that's scaring me like dark and light forces, you're gonna tell me I'm mentally ill? It's crazy. So nowhere to turn. One participant's fear of further psychiatric intervention after completely isolated in her experience. I was having not only at the hospital, the whole year. I kept having ideas, I kept having anxieties, I kept having ideas, you know, like the synchronicities. Maybe very dull, but they were still happening. I just couldn't talk to anybody, because then they would give me more medication. I was afraid that if I said anything, I was gonna end up in the hospital again. Another participant expressed how he is seriously fucked because of the mental health community's refusal to even acknowledge that non-dual states of consciousness are real. He said, the iatrogenesis of that is like trying to find an actual therapist who I can go to now who talk to me about this shit. Because I'm like, okay, I'm neurodivergent, traumatized, drug issues, and I'm ready to talk about this non-dual shit. But if you won't even acknowledge that it exists, then I know that you're just waiting to tell me that I'm delusional. So wrestling with paradox. For participants, they recognized that why and how the doctors would describe the label that they did, but what they said was that there was specific divergences from their presentation as opposed to what the diagnostic criteria was that went overlooked by the doctors, and the doctors also, they felt, weren't allowing them to have a say in their own mental health. So what they argued was that a divergence from the pathological label is paramount because their experiences aren't pathological and not indicative of lifelong illness. So the label, the pathological label simply doesn't apply. So I had two participants who used the term psychosis as I was interviewing them, and I asked them why. And I had one participant who was Nigerian American, and he is presently accepting of the term psychosis to describe his anomalous religious experience, but he sees the pragmatic compromise and a means of self-protection, considering that he's a Black man living in North America. As he expressed, I wish there was a world where I could just express it as a religious experience, but he recognizes that he was in a Black body that tends to be punished for those kind of deviants. He explained, I kind of interpret it as like honestly as a Black body. It's like I have a choice between juridical things, you know, like being criminalized, or you know, like people mental disorder you want to accept. And that's been my experience. Another participant stated, okay, so I'm giving you the technical name, which he used the term psychosis, but you know, who's the expert? The person who lived it or the doctors, okay? You have to, at some point, you should say, you know what? This lady calls it an awakening. We should understand that that's what it actually is. So what came up for participants is that one of the main reasons why their experiences fundamentally aren't pathological is because it's actually symbolic of healing from trauma. And it's usually latent trauma that they discussed from early childhood that was surfacing. So they also expressed that their experiences were tremendously impactful in expanding their sense of self, their perception of the world and shifting their priorities. And it also served as a call to social justice to change how people are treated within the mental health system, but also to change how these experiences are conceptualized. One participant expressed that pathologizing a subjective anomalous spiritual experiences is symptomatic of society's spiritual bankruptcy and its overwhelming tendency to be oppressively rationalist and too invested in scientism. This idea that like, nope, the way you know stuff is through evidence, to the exclusion of the validity of subjective experiences. And he states they're literally mistaking healing for illness, literally. Another participant expressed, I listened to like Ron Dass and Joseph Goldstein and this kind of stuff before and read Eckhart Tolle or whatever, but now I read it, like my understanding, my comprehension of it changed in an instant. I'm like, oh, that's a pretty good way to try and put it. Like, yeah, I've seen that shit too. Like, like we didn't just think of God to fool each other. I'm way more inclined to believe in like vibrations and dharma, like the Tao. I've never really believed in it before. I've not believed stuff and then I thought stuff is true, if that makes sense. But now I kind of believe that, like, yeah, if you got really advanced, you could walk on water. You can really bend reality with your mind. That you can really manifest stuff, but we're not pure enough for now. Now I kind of believe in magic more. Another participant said it changed me and it changed my concept of what is real and what is not. Also that I do believe we're multidimensional. I mean, I definitely am a different person. I think I'm more compassionate, I'm more focused. My dreams, as far as like what I want to do with my life, are much bigger than they were before this experience. So the clinical implications, there's a need within the mainstream psychological and psychiatric community to operate from a trauma-informed foundation, to recognize the importance of honoring the earned subjective explanatory models of experiencers, to recognize the validity of anomalous phenomena, so as to avoid iatrogenic consequences. It points to the importance of clinical utilization of the view code religious or spiritual problem. It points to the need for a primary diagnostic category, a spiritual emergency to be added to future DSM editions, as long as the psychiatric hospital remains the first point of contact for people experiencing spiritual emergencies. It showcases the demand for clinical practitioners who have as their foundation an openness, respect for, and interest in anomalous phenomena with religious or spiritual content. It points to the importance for greater communication and consensus between mental health and religious institutions, spiritual traditions, and other scientific disciplines, and it emphasizes the need for clinicians to recognize and to assist clients in not only processing and integrating latent trauma that often surfaces during these experiences, but also to process and integrate the trauma caused by the medical one. Thank you.
Slow, you have to go. Okay, yeah, I hope so. All right. Okay. I'm Sean Blackwell. My legal name is Sean McAllister. I'll get into that a little bit later, but online people know me as Sean Blackwell, okay? And I've actually been talking about the spiritual dimension of bipolar disorder since 2007. But it all started for me in 1996. I don't want to give too much away for the presentation, but in 96, I was taking an intensive self-help seminar, and they asked us to go into a fear meditation, meditating on our fear, and I didn't think I felt fear. And then in a second, I remembered a scuba diving accident that had happened 2 months earlier, and then boom, I just felt this big punch in my chest, this energy came out, and I just started weeping, and I realized that I did feel fear, and I stayed with that fear, and it just gave me this huge release. And then after that, my life changed completely. And it has never gone back to normal. Who would want to live in that? It was 7 years of depression for me, and that depression was gone after this experience. Now, I was hospitalized. Actually, at one point, like I said, I was hospitalized. The hospitalization was terrible. I thought the psychiatrists were idiots. They were completely cold with me, and they had no idea what I was going through. And it turned out that I was actually correct. I was having something that Colleen has described as a spiritual emergency or a spiritually transformative experience. And I learned about that language through Dr. Stan Groff like a year later. Okay. But when I really got into this work in 2007 was because I had two nieces, my wife's nieces in Brazil, who were being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. They both had acute psychosis in the same summer. Two sisters with their first psychosis in the same summer. And I was like, well, what's the difference between what's happened to them, this bipolar thing, and this thing that happened to me, which was amazing, like breakthrough. I was sure they had a breakthrough like I did, but I wanted to get some feedback because they were being medicated for life, you know? So I put this video up, and I have a lot more here and this and here. Am I bipolar or waking up? Was my first video and my first YouTube channel. And it was a 5-part video, 45 minutes, and the feedback was incredible that I got, okay? A lot of people being labeled with bipolar disorder having spiritual experiences that seem very similar to my own, so I knew I was on to something. 2011, I wrote my full story, and like Bipolar Waking Up, which talked about my own experience in detail, the integration process, and then actually working with my nieces, and in one case, working with one of my nieces right through psychosis as well. Yeah, but one thing that, was really driving my online curiosity was what was the difference, and this is thing to do what every therapist wants to know, what's the difference between a spiritual emergency or a spiritual breakthrough and a psychosis of bipolar disorder, We tend to think of it as somewhat separate categories, and in the back, it's kind of like, well, a spiritual emergency can be something difficult, but it's good things leading to a spiritual breakthrough. Psychosis is kind of a bad thing, leading to spiritual, or is leading to breakdown. So how do you tell the difference? Because the truth is, with psychiatry, acute psychosis could be labeled like for any of these things: the spiritual emergencies, acute psychosis, bipolar 1, schizophrenia, and it can actually vary depending on the part of the country that you're in. Like a more conservative part of the country might label it schizophrenia, where in California or San Francisco they might call it spiritual emergency, this kind of thing. So I wanted to give you a bit of a quiz here. What do you think, spiritual emergency or bipolar disorder? Ecstatic mood, a feeling of oneness, a sense of regaining knowledge, heightened senses. All of this happened with me, okay? And clearly, I see these things as quite spiritual experiences. What about this? Thinking you're dead and going to heaven, that you're being tested by God, that you're you're a central character in a movie like The Truman Show. Well, all of that happened to me too. I was sure I was in the middle of some kind of play, and everybody around me was like an angel or an actor, but I wasn't sure who. Right? Many people think that they're a Messiah figure. Thankfully, because I was sure I was dead, I knew I wasn't a Messiah figure. And you may have magical powers, and if you still think you have magical powers, feel free to use them as a safe space if I help the presentation. So anyways, yeah, bipolar. All of that can be spiritual emergency or bipolar. And then here, being on the floor of a hotel ballroom, guilty as charged, okay? That was part of my deal. And then I actually laid down in it because I thought I had to confront all my fear, and nothing could be scarier than just laying in your own pee. Taking off my clothes, yeah, I did that too. And then the police came and I resisted arrest, and so it got a little rough, But they were pretty well trained, actually. I have fond memories that took me in the stretcher and took me. I thought I was going to heaven. So you got to ask yourself, spiritual emergency or bipolar. If you're a professional, a clinician, it's really different. I have empathy. Paranoid thoughts is a little bit different. I wasn't that paranoid, and often in the work of Stan Roth, he'll point to paranoid thoughts as something you need to be very careful of if you want to try and support somebody through these things. Okay? But still, people in spiritual emergency can have suicidal thoughts. Dr. David Lukoff had suicidal thoughts. People can have moments of paranoia. So what I found in talking to hundreds of people on YouTube was that really there's a spectrum we're talking about. We're not talking about separate categories of experience. We're talking about a non-ordinary experience that for some people, it can be very blissful, like mostly it was for me. It can be recognized as mostly an internalized experience, like a process that I'm undergoing. It tends to be more on the loving side of things, non-violent, and the interpretations can be symbolic. So, like when I had a vision of a pink light above me, like a white light turned pink, I was sure it was a symbol of God's love. But then at the other end of the spectrum, the content can be very disturbing. It's externalized, people think things are happening to them. It's fearful and scary. Because it's all of those things, it's potentially violent, and the interpretations are concrete, so that if you see a devil or Jesus in front of you, that's it. That's exactly what's going on, and if other people can't see it, it's a mistake on their part. Right? So, and those ends of the spectrum tend to get labeled spiritual emergency and bipolar, or spiritual emergency is labeled bipolar disorder 1, But for the bulk of people who are labeled with bipolar, they tend to have a mix of this. They have the disturbing and the blissful, the internalized part and the externalized part, the fearful and the loving, etc. So what to make of this? Like, what is the source of this divergence? Well, that was part of what I was looking at for the first 5 years of my work here, talking to people week after week. And one thing I found quite early, especially through the work of Dr. John Reed, is that trauma causes mental disorders. It's a huge part of it. And just one simple quote from him is that child physical and sexual abuse are incredibly predictive of psychosis, much more than any genetic factor. And in fact, trauma in the broadest sense, can happen in a wide variety of ways, going right back to the birth process. Okay. So if we want to look at underlying factors for the nature of a psychosis, trauma is definitely one of them, with high trauma at one end, where things are more disturbing, low trauma at the other. There's one more factor, which is, before I get to that, just a few simple examples. You might consider sex abuse to be a highly traumatized situation, teenage bullying for the medium, and then emotional repression, like a low traumatized situation. I was dealing with a lot of emotional repression during my situation. The other factor, though, is also maturity, or, we can call it the evolution of consciousness of a person. And there's a relationship here where people who are highly traumatized have more of a challenge maturing. They tend to stay less mature even into their adult years. And then people who have less trauma in their lives, they have more of an opportunity to mature. So there's this general relationship that I found in talking to people. All right. And then looking at that, and then one other thing is, if we look at the evolution of consciousness, what is a less mature person? Well, to keep things simple, it would be somebody who's quite impulsive and selfish, not considering other people in their actions or decision making. Okay, and then a conference like this, which values diversity, for example, would be like a higher level consciousness event. Okay, so people value diversity as sort of a higher level consciousness person. Right? Okay, here's what's interesting. When people live their lives from a lower consciousness place, they see the world, they see themselves as victims in the world. Things are happening to them. They don't accept their own responsibility. They live with a more fearful orientation. They're potentially more violent, and they see things in a more concrete way. When people develop, they internalize, they see their role in everything that's going on around them. They're more loving, non-violent, and they see things more symbolically. So does that ring a bell? That's basically what we've got here. So it should come as no surprise that when we look at somebody with a disturbing psychosis, they tend to be someone who is more highly traumatized and are living with less maturity. The spiritual emergency person tends to be more developed and have less trauma in their lives. And the vast majority of people are having a sort of mixed experience, and there's someone in the middle, okay? And what's important is, again, there's no dividing line. This is like a continuous flow experience here. We're just sort of putting labels here, just as markers along the way to have an idea of what we're dealing with. And then, of course, these are typically labeled schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and spiritual emergencies when people are aware of that. Because the spiritual emergency is the one process of psychosis where, with the capacity to internalize, and you've got an easier process to go through, you can actually have a breakthrough and go through these things. And here, the probability of healing is certainly higher in the upper right than the lower left. Okay, and when I'm working with clients, because it's sort of expensive to work with people, okay? I tend to be looking for people in that upper right-hand corner because the risks are much higher in the lower left. It's much more difficult, and I've given it a try just to test my theories. And yeah, it has been more of a challenge to work with people in the lower left-hand corner of this profile, definitely. All right, so what to make of this? What's the bigger implication here? We're not in boxes anymore, we're sort of in a spectrum, and definitely one part of the spectrum is spiritual. Well, I think it's time for a paradigm shift in the whole way we look at this. The typical medical model sees it as bones and meat and chemicals, and that's what we're made of. But the transpersonal model also sees us with the bioenergetic system, you can call it a chakra or Kundalini system. okay? And my conclusions and how I work with people is I see this whole range of experiences as being caused by emotional trauma. The trauma is held in blockages in this bioenergetic system. And that the healing disorder, we need to release blockages from the system. And so, well, how do you do that? Well, guess what? There are techniques, but they don't come from typical therapy. They come from the somatic healing, okay? So I believe that more research needs to be done on somatic healing practices to heal these blockages. One of those somatic healing practices is what I do from my website, bipolarAwakenings.com. I'm a certified holotropic breathwork facilitator, and that's about as somatic as you can get. I don't have time to talk about that today, but you can look at my website, bipolarAwakenings.com, see what I do there. And it's a paradigm shift. I can guarantee you that, okay? Thank you.
That was great, Sean, and you thought you were rid of me. I'm back. The last year of my training in child and adolescent psychiatry, I suddenly developed severe panic attacks out of the blue. I sought my psychoanalyst and again realized that June of that year, I was going to turn 33. And any of you in the Christian tradition can understand why I thought I was going to be crucified or killed in a tragic manner. That connection with Jesus Christ just seems to pop up. I also had experiences with the mental health system. In midlife, my father developed a major depressive episode, became catatonic, paranoid, would not eat, and the only thing that pulled him out of it was ECT and medications, and after that, he had a totally normal rest of his life. 2 years later, his sister, my aunt, had manic episodes, treated with lithium eventually, and had normal life the rest of her life. I have been being treated for a major depressive disorder for 35 years. None of what I've told you today has been revealed to my profession until just within the last year. The stigma within our profession in recovery and addiction, you can share in the peer support network. But in psychiatry, in mental health, sharing has such a stigma, and that's part of why I'm coming out, because we hope that that will change. And show how these experiences have led to this understanding. I ended this with the experiences of self-worth that are injured, the expressions of dignity that are injured, especially during adolescence. There is another level, and what happens that made this almost like magic was when we processed the self-worth and the dignity, when we strengthened it, something automatically happened. There was a spiritual opening that just spontaneously would be present. Now I have to put the sign the opposite way, because the psychedelics literally open that spiritual core. And if any of you are familiar with the research, the processing brings a person to a greater sense of self-worth and dignity. Why this all works is because there is another level that we call the creative forces or creative openings. Why? Because when they hit us, they're powerful. And as I've been working with this model, I've had those tremendous experiences. One of the first is the experience of love, not like a feeling, not like a commitment like I love you, but the agape, the grand love of God, of the divine, of life, of self, whatever we want to call it, it opens. In the domain of thinking, what opens is what we see as a truth force. Mahatma Gandhi talks about the Satyagraha, the truth force, the built-in mechanism that recognizes when human worth and dignity have been injured. And all of you felt that a few years ago when you saw George Floyd's murder Your gut felt it. It's wired in when we allow it to develop. And in the domain of action, and this was one that blew me because I had thrown faith as a real experience and word away. I have developed a faith in people, in humanity, in this process that is unshakable. And it got tested when my wife committed suicide. And I was lost. And the only way I could get through it was to hold on, knowing that there's got to be a purpose here. And by synchronicity, people showed up. And people showed up and guided me to the next step. I would be in places, I don't know why I'm at this yoga retreat. I don't do yoga. And the person that spoke next said something that absolutely told me I'm in the right place. So I had some wonderful guides along the way, but what's different is this is not faith like a belief. This is faith as an action. When I live by jumping into whatever is next with no guarantee of what's on the other side and no guarantee that I'm even going to make it, but when I'm jumping, I'm ecstatic. For me, that's life now. Because that is where I found the meaning and purpose in my life. In working with this model, when we open people to the deepest level, our meaning and purpose is wired into us. Because all of that hurt of self-worth and dignity, when I find something that fulfills all of that hurt, that's my life. And that's what I found. And that's why I'm here. So there is this unseen order in the subjective world that we can use now clinically. We are trying to do research because we now have a human research model to demonstrate this, and we just finished one study, because it looks like there is truly a spiritual core, functionally somehow, we don't know yet, hopefully we'll find out, is wired into us. And I have a whole theory about that if you want to talk to me later. But it is truly, as Stan Groff presciently recognized, is holotropic. For me, this is the hope for humanity. We have something within us, driving us as every human being toward our greater sense of self-worth and dignity. For me, that's the only hope for the world right now. So I'll just leave you, the other thing, that when that spiritual core opens, it opens with the characteristics of mystical experiences. That sense of connectedness, aliveness, wholeness. It may feel like it's coming from out here or coming from in here. The serenity, the thinking just goes on overdrive and is clear. The gratitude is enormous. The synchronicity blows my mind. It is mystical. The meaning is there. And I have had tremendous experience. I'll give you I'm going to work one day and I get out of the car and I have trouble breathing. I don't know what's going on. I said, well, this has to have some meaning because I'm not having an asthma attack. What did I discover? I was experiencing a joy I hadn't felt since I was 5 years. And my body could hardly handle it. It was as if my chest was going to burst. So these are the opportunities that are available. So finally, the new model. If we put spirituality in the center and big, because most people have spiritual religious connection, you can fit neuroscience, ecology, religious community, spiritual practices, and at the core is this spiritual core. Medicine and psychiatry need to learn that is this spiritual core that is the source of emotional healing. We don't know how much physical healing yet, but when it comes to trauma, when it comes to those types of life experiences, it is life-saving, because what gets damaged most with trauma is faith. Faith in themselves, faith in life, faith in the world. So this is what my 5-year plan is, is to have the next DSM put spirituality not just as a little line or maybe even a new set of problems, but a central focus. It's time that we recognize this as professionals. Anyone interested in working with me, please let me know during the conference, and I'll leave here. And I'm gonna, the model is designed to move psychiatry out of a categorical pathological model. Because it focuses us on well-being of self-worth and dignity and spiritual connectedness. So it may not get rid of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia as biological disorders, but it gives the whole field another direction. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Janice, who is telling you how, you're going to tell them how I'm here, right?
Yeah, but you're gonna tell them why you're investing in me and the.
Oh, I'll tell them. I'm going to tell you why I'm here. Because of Janet. About 1.5 years ago, Janet had a spiritual experience, I think you're going to talk about, right? And she was hospitalized, and she just happened to be hospitalized at the university where I am a faculty member. And she came looking to talk with someone, and I'm about the only person at Rutgers University that will use the word spirituality. So it ended up coming to me. I heard her story. I spent a whole day with her, and I diagnosed her as not having had a bipolar disorder. 3 years of trauma. It broke my heart. And it had me decide to come out. And so we're working on a movie to bring this out to a commercial public level, not just the damages that are happening to people with spiritual experience in the mental health system, because very much some are broken, but the opportunities that many of you have found from these difficult struggles with spiritual experiences. Most of you will probably agree with me that when you get to make sense of it, it is truly profound and life-changing and transformative, and we need to have the public recognize that. So, you ready? Was that good enough, Jen?
That was excellent, thank you, thank you. So, as I introduced myself, I said I'm business. I've been a corporate executive most of my life. I launched my own consulting practice, very, very successful in many major corporations, including many pharmaceuticals. I have a lot of pharmaceutical firms that I cared for on leadership development and communication skills and culture and systemic change. And I did that in between 2 hospitalizations. So my story is brief, but it covers well over 40 years or over 40 years. And after I do a little brief, we're going to show you a short video to see what are some of the work we're doing with the documentary and the movie. So my story starts when I'm in college and my master's degree in counseling. It's 1979. I'm 25 years old. I am initiating a divorce. That was only a 2-year very unhappy marriage. And as I initiated that, I'm starting to feel empowered again. I felt very suppressed. So I'm starting to go through a spiritual awakening, and it continues to what is just a beautiful spiritual transformative experience. I'm pretty high over this, just finally feeling free and good and very, very connected to Holy Spirit. I'll shorten it that my college looked at me as in a manic episode. I did not run naked. I did not take my clothes off. Never felt, I didn't fall into that. I was just very grounded in it, but I was high. So I was really given a choice to go home and leave school or go into Rutgers Mental Health Clinic. I chose to go in because I figured I'd work my way in and out and get back to college. If I went home, I would probably experience no talking and I might get lost. I would be lost and probably never come back. So I actually chose under some amount of coercion and spent 2 weeks, was put on lithium. And when I got out, I complied, I lowered my dose over a few months. Found out that I lowered my dose, but the psychiatrist I was required to see said, but you're doing well, so we're gonna kind of keep you on that. As soon as I graduated, I was off and I did not go on lithium for the next 25 years. I had no episodes, I was a corporate success. I attribute it to the spiritual experience, because when I had it, I was like, what is this? Am I supposed to be a nun? Am I supposed to be a minister? It was just so amazing. And the thought, the knowing was go out to corporate and do as much as you can in corporate to transform the work environment and get people through a paradigm shift by the year 2000. It was crystal clear like that. That's exactly what I did. So I go through 25 years of successful work. I did not speak of this experience, not with my family, not with friends, not with corporate. Why? Why wouldn't I speak of it? Kind of like Dr. Chatlos. It's absolute horrible stigma. Like they would not have hired me in the next round, and my family didn't want to talk about it. So I kept it quiet. So the second part, and I'll probably shorten this a little bit, my business derailed. So I went through around the year 2003, 2004, and I just was burned out from lots of success, derailed. And so I came home and took care of my son for a while. But within another year, I was invited to Wall Street. I would go up to Wall Street and present to financial investors for what? To fund the training of medical students on the spiritual side of mental health. So I have some Wall Street friends saying, let's go do this. We see the DSM, we see your research, we believe you. So I go on Wall Street, excellent presentation. They were psyched that was already in the DSM and people were being ignored, etc. So I get excited. You're allowed to get excited, right? And not be mad. I go home and tell my mother. Guess what my mother does? Take a guess. 911. I didn't have 988 then. She was operating under the label from 25 years before that I was diagnosed with manic depressive. She said all this research, because I brought boxes of research, it was like a little manic, but not out of control. And she says, you're having that thing again. And it was more, she was frightened. She was absolutely frightened. So I get escorted by the police, which I was very clear, and I said, I am going in involuntary. I'm going longer than I thought, but let me just finish. So I get into the hospital, and two things that were written into my medical report made me want to be here today and launch a documentary and a movie. Guess what my medical report said? Delusions of grandeur, think she's connected to Wall Street. It's written. We're going to show it in the documentary. And the second part is I'm actually talking to the finance guys on the psych ward, and they want to sue the state of New Jersey. And I said, I don't want to do a lawsuit. That's not me. I said, but we're going to make a movie. So I got heard by the staff, and they write that down. Delusions of grandeur, think she's going to make a movie. So when they confronted me, I said, oh, I was only kidding. And they said, you shouldn't kid like that because you wrote it down. 18 years later, we are making the movie. While I finish, could you see if you can get it's almost up if somebody wants to get it up. So it took 18 or less, 18, 17, 16 years for me to start. The beginning of this year, we had 2 people on our team, Dr. Chatlos and myself. We have 42 members of people representing around the world of lived experience and expertise. We are creating, oops, it has to go back, see if you can bring it back to here again.
Let me find out.
And also help us read
Just bring it. You don't like that.
Hold on, I got it. It's not a touch screen.
Oh.
Ready?
So what we're gonna show you is a short clip of a demo that we're building for the movie. The movie's called Calling Back the Witness Stand. It's instead of going for a court case, but we're going to show the legal parts of the whole rights and a court case. So it's a fictionalized court case based on my true story and many of our team here. The documentary is called Breaking Down, Breaking Open, Breaking Through. That is not fiction. That is all the research that we've been hearing today, including those experiences around the world. So we're doing both at the same time, and all depending on which funding comes in first. So short piece. And after this, I'm just going to ask any of our panel if they want to comment on why are they investing in this, including Denise, because Denise is part of us. And then we'll ask for any other questions. So are we good, ready to go? Can't see it. So while we're doing that.
Zoom can't see it.
They can now.
Now, she fixed it.
Yeah, you want to push
Excellent.
play?
This takes 8 minutes. You can watch a short clip and you can imagine hundreds of hours of filming that's behind this. And this is called no budget. It's at the moment. Anna Biltmore is my character's name. It's me,
Oh,
this
okay.
character.
Forced hospitalization can feel like an assault on the individual by the mental health system. Janet Werner was not only assaulted and falsely accused of being bipolar in 1979, she endured 25 years of struggle to clarify a serious misdiagnosis, resulting in navigating stigma, prejudice, suppression, depression, loss of her voice and agency, only to be assaulted again by limited thinking within the mental health system in 2005. Janet Werner had an extraordinary spiritual experience with an acute psychotic episode that would have resolved on its own without meds. Medications can dull a person and may lead to further misdiagnosis created by the medications. Her spiritual experience should have been respected. The standard of care should have included spiritual support. She does not have a bipolar disorder diagnosis.
Calling God to the witness stand is a signature as to this new movement, this new understanding that's dawning into the minds of humanity. It's larger than me, it's larger than you, it's ours, it's our movement, and I'm honored to be alive at this particular time to share it with you.
I think that by having experts question an experiencer and have this debate around it, they're going to be able to, the observer, the witness of this movie, is going to be able to hear this from a different perspective.
When I think about the possibilities of a movie that has charm, wit, intrigue, also extremely real pain and challenge, and the ways we don't treat each other the way we could and should, I think this one really has the potential to highlight challenges within the mental health industry, how people have been treated, sometimes with the best of intentions, but still things haven't been done as well as they might be. And I think it can shed light on that and also help us rethink how we undertake mental health and the convergence with our spiritual lives, and be a very entertaining movie all at the same time.
This film is extremely timely, given the growing momentum to dismantle psychiatric systems. It is a watershed project that exposes the failings of these systems. I have no doubt that it will empower clientele to demand change, be shown in universities around the world, and inspire people to create a new and better system.
I think that this film is so important because there is a huge community of people out there that is unfortunately growing all the time, of people who have had their emotions, their spiritual experiences, their human experience diseasified by this system of psychiatry, and as a result put on or even forced onto drugs that are extremely dangerous in long-term use for a lot of people.
I really believe that this kind of movie is very important, specifically now, because I do believe that we are standing at the precipice of a new day, one in which we as a society collectively and individually can begin to recognize that we are all spiritual beings on a trajectory of growth that is meant to be never ending. And frankly, we could just keep it at that and figure out the specifics of that at some point, later on. That'd be awesome. But really, just to be able to recognize that the entire world is experiencing the beginning of what feels to be a true global awakening, and that we're all at different stages of that awakening, whether we're conscious of that or not. And I do think that pathologizing these experiences does such a dishonor to the true nature of what it means to be human.
We're now talking about 2 in 8 people, or 2 in 9 people who are living with a mental disorder right now. And we want to ask ourselves a number of questions with those statistics, those disturbing statistics, and say, how many of those people right now are not aware that they're just going through a spiritual crisis that has led to a mental illness? And how many of those people were denied access to healthcare or have no access to mental health care at all, which means that they're denied of their basic human right? And how many of people who are able to access basic mental care were misdiagnosed and suffered unnecessarily because there was no training about identifying a spiritual crisis that has led to a mental illness? So this movie is very, very important because it's a platform and it's a way of reaching out to millions and billions of people who need help and can get access to it.
I think it has multiple values. I think there are many people who are having similar experiences and they don't know where to turn to for help. So I think just by depicting a case, because this is essentially a case study, just by depicting a case on a broad scale such as this, you reach a lot of people who may be going through similar experiences, and that it hopefully connects them to resources that are better able to support them. That's the first one. And then secondly, if this project can influence some change within the helping professions and also within educational systems to provide better training, better understanding, then that would be fantastic as well, because I think that the system needs to change in order to meet clients where they're at. And spiritual needs are very important. And I think we could do better.
Calling God to witness is a weapon, and we believe that once this move is out, it's going to transform lives of many people. It's going to shape minds of different kind of people with different portfolios, to understand and to respect people who are facing some kind of spiritual awakening. Those people who are facing a lot of calling from God, they should be respected, and people should understand that if mental illness and call from God and the issues of shamanic need to be treated differently. So I really appreciate for this calling to God witness, because I am now able to understand deeper things.
I think this movie is incredibly important, because it's incredibly important to shine a light on what is happening to almost a generation of young people right now. This kind of movie, for me, is paramount of importance.
So it's all in development. A lot of this is homegrown footage. We are working with professional filmmakers as we go into next year. Anyone that is interested to either be in it, support it, collaborate it, please see me after. Right now, we'll take questions to any of the panel or comments about the project. Yes.
I have a question. Wait, we need the mic.
Oh. I was cooking and forgot. Do I need to give this to her, right? Sorry.
Congratulations to you, this is great, and I'm so glad to hear you guys like talking my language. As a Mumble, this is like right in the line of spiritual awakening, but I have a question about generational trauma. We keep saying child trauma, but how about generational? What if we didn't have any type of trauma? How's that? Yeah.
Intergenerational trauma is a very interesting subject for me because I didn't know that much about it when I studied the Stanley Law. But I did a lot of work over 6 years. I was doing retreats with people with bipolar disorder in Germany. And there I started to see the links to World War II, Nazi past, things like this. Worked with one woman whose German ancestors were actually put in concentration camps in Yugoslavia because their dictator Tito created concentration camps for Germans during World War II. I didn't even believe her at first. I thought it was like some sort of excuse to get away from the Nazi past. But then I looked it up and sure enough, Tito had these concentration camps and that material started to surface. So I definitely think that the issues of our parents and ancestors can be carried through in generations. In two ways, energetically, you just carry that energy, but also just the way you're treated, growing up with shell-shocked and war-torn parents, used to, cold and sometimes abusive parenting, and then you're taking on that. So I think it's a big thing. Of course, in the Black community, it's slave history. I mean, that's not an easy legacy to recover from.
We have some online, quick comment. We have an online question. Did you want to add?
I was just gonna say thank you for bringing that up because I think that's much fun. I had a participant who was a Salvadorian and she spoke to the generational trauma birth defense during her experience.
Okay, we have a question coming from our audience online. This person said, I have a concern that darker spiritual experiences, which seem to be connected to schizophrenia in Blackwell's model, appear to be viewed as immature, less spiritual, less hopeful. How can we not stigmatize darker spiritual experiences in schizophrenia when working to bring spiritual recognition in mental health work?
Well, I gotta say, the key is, well, first my work needs to get more sophisticated, I'll say that. But the key is, do you have the capacity to internalize the process? If you're someone who can recognize what's going on, it's going on inside of you and work from that perspective, you can heal. And I've worked with people through demonic energy. But on the whole, yeah, I guess it will be more stigmatized. I can't deny that some people, their process is going to be more difficult than others. But one thing that could have helped, I think, is to recognize that the whole spectrum is basically just one big normal experience. Some people have easier processes to deal with than others. And that's just a reality that we face. And hopefully down the road we get better at healing people who are being medicated for life for all ends of the spectrum. But right now we're at zero. We can't close to it.
Calvin, do you want to comment? And then we'll still take another question from here before we go online. We'll take you next. Calvin?
Sean was just making me think, that part of it may have to do with attitude, and we're still trying to understand this. That if the attitude is, I have schizophrenia and I'm doomed for life, well, my God, what's gonna happen? There's gonna be more symptoms. But if I have an attitude that maybe this has a real sign of my meaning and my purpose, and if I keep going, if I reach out and ask for help, maybe I will discover something that's important. I think that alone will transform the system, hopefully.
We have one question here and then over there.
Yeah, so I read the book, It Didn't Start With You,
which talks about, that generational trauma is also passed down through the methylation of the genes. Have you guys investigated that at all?
I haven't. You're talking about epigenesis, and it's a hot topic in biology, and it is legitimate. It really does appear, and they're now able to do studies in animal studies with traumatizing and looking at 2 or 3 generations later, and it's DNA changes, not in the DNA that is sperm cell and germ cell DNA, but it's the DNA in the rest of the cells that does and can get passed down. So there's really a legitimacy in terms of the biology, much more than we ever would have imagined. And yeah, it's for real.
I'm interested in the therapies that you practice. And so Sean, like why did you gravitate towards holotropic breath work? And then also Dr. Chatlos, if you could speak a little bit about the spiritually focused therapies in AP, so then facing addiction and incarceration. Like what did those therapies look like, and why did you choose that pathway of therapy?
Well, I experienced holotropic breath work working in a Grob workshop years earlier. And sort of, I knew the fundamentals of it being related to releasing trauma, that sort of idea. And I knew that Grob had been drawn to that work because he saw patients in psychosis hyperventilating spontaneously, and that they seemed to improve. And I saw that with one of my nieces as well. She started to have an accelerated heart, she was breathing faster, and then there was like a release, it was like healing. So I got curious about the holotropic breath work almost from the very beginning, but I knew it was contraindicated for people with disorders because in a typical breathwork context, they don't have, it's usually in a group setting, it's usually for a limited time frame, and I didn't, it was contraindicated because Groff didn't think it was safe enough to do, because they were afraid that someone with a deeper disorder might have an experience that would be just too out of control for a group setting. And so I started to think, well, what if we gave people a retreat that was private for like 10 straight days where I'm working with them, and they've got another supporter, so it's like private trained support, facilitation, and for basically an unlimited time frame. And then I went out, my first retreat was 3 weeks, and I dated 3 weeks with a woman from Romania because the last week was there just in case she entered into acute psychosis, I would have a week to bring her back. Because I had supported people in psychosis as well previously. And it was, I had some progress, but it was sporadic. You know, it was more like a Sectarian method. But I needed more structure, and I went out to Romania, and the first retreat was quite successful, it was quite good. I didn't need to hospitalize, and actually I've done over 50 retreats and haven't had to hospitalize anybody. So, you know, it was a lot of risk for a lot of years, but now that I'm sort of stronger at it, I'm more confident to work in the United States illegally. Because I know the risk of being sued in a place that sues people a lot is a lot lower. So like my focus from the very beginning and why I have a model where it's like, okay, where am I? Ideal clients is my main priority is staying out of jail. That's the main thing. The other thing is nobody gets killed. And of course, both. You stay out of jail, make sure nobody gets killed. That's the first thing. So yeah, so my apologies if I'm a little conservative.
So Dr. Chatlos, was there a question for Dr. Chatlos?
I probably live in more of an intellectual world than an emotional embodied world. And that's why and how my approach developed. It is actually a psychotherapeutic without body work, but it had to all be embodied through their experiences. So any attempt to avoid their emotional or their body reactions had to be dealt with. And as this model has developed over the years, I've been, my opportunities to use it have been clinical. And so it just happened to be where I could explore with it, and I started seeing more and more results, and it just seemed to both see results clinically and create a model that was predictable. And that was the original goal. Can I create some understanding so that when this patient confronts me with what doesn't make any sense from anything I know, I'm not going to panic. I'm going to be with them. I'm going to listen to them and sort of help have them guide me to where they need to be. And they were the ones, but believe me, the majority of this model, the details actually came from the people that I was with. Not all were treated, not all were clinical, some of them were just people normally in some religious institutions. So that's how I got to where I'm doing today.
Well,
Okay,
we're
we
gonna
have-
take a question
Yeah, we
here
have
and then
4 minutes left, so we have to take a question from the online people, and then we'll see how much time. How do we provide and fund non-pathological services to the most marginalized and affected folks that are trapped on Medicaid, Medicare services, and pay for better care for those with low or no insurance?
Who wants to take that?
I'll start with a simple thing. The work I've been looking at shows a simple language change and understanding of what we mean by experiences of self-worth and dignity, the way it's operationalized. If we could change, there's nothing opposed to any of the treatment psychotherapeutic methods, but if that language could be out here in the world, that spontaneous spiritual opening will eventually happen. Beyond that, when it comes to funding, I can't either.
We have one question here, which might bring us.
I'm very sympathetic to the idea of you change medicalizing human suffering in response to difficulties in life. So I'm all in about that. Have any of you written about or seen published a practical approach to the idea of spiritual emergency? So, for example, if a person in our society now, if a person is observed having taken their clothes off and urinating in public, the police are called. The person's taken to the hospital. And what would your system look like? How should society deal with that?
Would like to take it.
Yeah, we're practically attempting that now, and it's actually being done nationwide. How many of you are familiar with 988? 988 is the service to replace 911. Ideally, and it is operating very well, is that the call will not go to the police. It will be screened by someone that says, do I call a peer support? Do I call a mental health worker? Do I call the police? Do I call a chaplain or the minister that we may have on staff? And some of the towns in our state have teams of these groups of people available. The 988 system has only been in operation for a year. It's got some other organizational dysfunctions, but it is the opportunity. We are trying to get them to include spirituality in their training, which they aren't doing yet. But that, to me, is the best opportunity. It is funded around the country. Every state is expected, and there's a fair amount of money for it.
And then we're gonna wrap up.
I'm just wrapping up my second book of my experience of the last 7 years, and one set of conclusions I came to was that I think that there's something very valuable in working with people who are going into extreme states from psychiatry, from psychology, from the peer support movement, and also particularly from the shamanic aspect of spirituality, because I think that's where the real healing is. Okay? But I think all four are going to be necessary, and they don't necessarily need to fight with each other. And right now, there's like combat between these certain territories, you know, especially between peer support and psychiatry. I mean, that's just a war. But even psychiatry, psychology, and spirituality is ignored. I think it all has to be there, and once that's recognized, I think you could really have a big difference in how people are treated and the outcome. The outcomes could be much better.
Colleen, would you like to make a closing comment, and then Denise is closing, just so we get a chance to. Questions, do you have any closing comments? No, you're good? Denise?
Okay, I wanna, invite you to the lobby for reception and award ceremony. And before we go, I want to thank the participants, the speakers here. And for those online, please make sure you get in touch with the speakers if you need a link to Janet's video, because someone was asking for a link, or if you need any slides, feel free to communicate with the presenters. Thank you.